Thanks for the invitation. So a couple notes. One, I just posted my slides on Figshare. You can find the link on my Twitter account, Russ Poldrack. Two is, problem with going at the end of the day is that everybody ends up talking about all the things you wanted to talk about. So I'm going to skip over a few things. Also, I'd like to make this as interactive as a thing like this can be. So if you have questions in the middle of the talk, feel free to jump in and say something. And I'm happy to stop and say more because I think there's going to be a lot of repetition here. So let's see. There we go. OK. This is a plot of the number of fMRI papers in PubMed over time. So there's now well over 50,000 papers that mention fMRI and the brain. So how much of this data do you think is actually accessible to us? We don't really know, but the guess would be probably no more than about that. And that's including things like NeuroSynth and BrainMap that don't really have all the data. They have an incredibly sparse sort of summary of the data. So we've been thinking for a few years about how to address this by developing an open ecosystem for imaging meta-analysis and data sharing. So there's a trade-off, right, which is between sort of the breadth of the data and the depth of the data. So sort of high breadth, low depth is something like coordinates. You've already heard Tal talk about NeuroSynth. I'll mention that. In the middle is what you might think about as a sweet spot, which is sort of decent bit of depth, but also decent bit of breadth, which is NeuroVault, which you've already heard about in a number of talks, and I'll mention a bit. And then finally, there are some things that you can only do with the complete raw data set. And so the OpenfMRI project is something that we started a long time ago to try to address that. And it's, as of this week, going to sort of start transitioning over to a new project that we call OpenNeuro, which I'll say a bit about, which actually Chris Gorgolewski will be talking about the OpenNeuro project tomorrow afternoon in one of the talk sessions. So you should definitely check out his talk. What do I mean by open? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. What I mean is basically minimal restrictions on the use of the data. So for everything that we do, we use the minimally restricted license that we can. In general, this is something like what's called a public domain dedication or a CC0 license, which basically means anybody can take the data and do whatever they want with it. That might make some people uncomfortable. For us, it means that the data can be maximally reused. And most people behave well. So if they take your data and do something with it, they're going to credit you and cite your paper that the data came from and so on. We think it's the right way to do open science. Another thing open means is sort of programmatically available, that you don't have to email somebody to get the data. You don't have to go clicking on web pages to get the data, that you can get the data programmatically via a web API. This is an example of what the NeuroVault web API looks like, where you can programmatically grab any particular image that you want to grab and get sort of a bunch of metadata about that particular image. Most of you probably were here for Tal's talk and already heard a bunch about NeuroSynth. I'm not going to tell you more about it other than to say that it fits our sort of description as an open resource. All the data are freely available under very permissive licenses, has a web API, has a Python package, so it allows all these kinds of really sort of open programmatic reuses. You've also heard a lot about why we need to move towards image-based meta-analysis from coordinate-based meta-analysis, and obviously the constraint there is having the right data. Chris Gorgolewski started the NeuroVault project a few years ago to try to address this need, to basically provide people with a really easy way to share their statistical maps. If you haven't checked out NeuroVault, you definitely have to check it out. You've already seen pictures like this. So when you upload data to NeuroVault, it comes in as what we call a collection, which is a set of related images. If you dig into one of those, this is for one of Chris's data sets, and you see there's a different image here for each of the different contrasts that were done. And you can dig into one of those, and you see there's this little analysis tab here that has, you've already seen one example in Tal's talk of how this can be used for decoding. There's also another set of cool things there. The first one is power analysis. So Joka Durnez in my group has developed a tool called NeuroPower Tools. And if you click on the power analysis button, it'll take you to NeuroPower Tools, and you have to go through a few tabs to get here. But ultimately, you can get a power analysis that tells you how many subjects would you need to replicate that finding with a particular level of power. So it makes it trivially easy to run a power analysis. You've also already heard about gene expression decoding from Tal, and so you have this map. You can click the gene expression button. It'll look at the data from the Allen Brain Atlas, and I completely agree with Tal that this requires a lot of skepticism about what comes out of it. But nonetheless, if you're interested in knowing what genes show patterns of expression across the brain that are correlated with your activation map, you can get that with just a couple of clicks in NeuroVault. And finally, if you have a map and you want to do quote-unquote cognitive decoding with NeuroSynth, it's very easy. It's one click, and you get this map that shows you what are the terms that were most strongly associated, whose meta-analytic maps are closest to your actual map. In this case, it was a map of people doing verb generation, and it gets it right. It says phonological language and so on. So that's just a small set of the things you can do with NeuroVault. You can also press a button, and I think Camille mentioned this, and instantly share your data to NeuroVault within SPM. Hopefully the other tools will build this in as well. Simon asked whether the data are biased, and the answer is yes, they are. We think they're actually biased in a positive direction. There are data showing that people who share data actually do better science. And so we think, if anything, we're getting the best data out there from the people who are willing to share their data. There's a lot of reasons why that might be, but nobody's going to argue that it's unbiased. So NeuroVault is also a completely open resource. The data are all CC0. Do whatever you want with them. The source code is all released under an unrestricted license. We also mirror the data in the Stanford Digital Repository. So even if Chris Gorolewski and I go away, or Stanford is sort of raised in an earthquake, the data are stored somewhere else, and somebody could get them and sort of reconstitute the thing. And it's going to outlive us. You just have to trust the Stanford library is going to be around for a while. And we have a web API, as you've already seen, you can get all the data from. Okay, so finally, sometimes you really want the complete raw data set. And so several years ago, we started sharing complete raw data sets in the OpenfMRI project. Again, no restrictions on data access. Do whatever you want with them. We ask you to be nice and cite us, but we're not going to sue you if you don't. So one of the fundamental features of OpenfMRI, if I just put data online and say, hey, download my data and do stuff with it, if you don't know what's there, it's not useful to you. So we, a long time ago, started developing a framework for organizing and describing the data. More recently, we've kind of worked with a bunch of people across the field to develop kind of the next generation of that format we call BIDS, the Brain Imaging Data Structure. You can find out more about it at the website here. It's basically a way of describing an imaging data set so that if I give it to you, you can go analyze it without having to talk to me. That's my goal. I want to be able to analyze data without ever having to talk to the people who made it, because the data set should include everything I need to analyze it. And we have a validator, so if you have a data set, you think it's in the proper BIDS format, but you want to make sure, go to the BIDS validator, and it'll actually just in your web browser check and tell you, does it follow the format? This is what one of the pages on OpenfMRI looks like. And you see, the data are sort of available in BIDS format. You can download, in this case, the data for all subjects, metadata, and some derivatives. It has information about, what was done. And you can also access it programmatically, either directly through our Amazon S3 bucket or through the DataLad project. So DataLad is basically a project that gives you sort of easy access to lots of different data sets, including all the OpenfMRI data sets. The data have been getting increasingly reused. Can I see a show of hands of anybody who's ever worked with OpenfMRI data? Okay. There should be more hands in the air. So as of earlier this year, we found 173 reuses, mostly published papers. If you estimate the value of that reuse, it's on the order, if people had to go collect those data on their own, it's at least about $3 million worth of data. This is a plot of the cumulative reuses over time. You can see it's been going up a lot in the last few years. So I mentioned that we're moving to a new platform called OpenNeuro, which basically just came out in beta. You can find it at openneuro.org. And basically what this lets you do is, if you have a data set in the BIDS format, you want to either analyze it or share it. You upload it. Basically, there's a set of workflows you'll be able to apply to the data automatically. And the computing is all paid for by us or by the Arnold Foundation that's nice enough to give us money to do it. And the quid pro quo is you agree that your data will be shared no less than 18 months down the road. You have an 18-month grace period, but then basically the data will be shared openly. So you basically agree in exchange for free computing to make your data open. Like I said, Chris is talking about that more tomorrow. So finally, we need to be able to annotate the data. We need to be able to know what the data are about beyond just what specific trials happened when. So we might want to know what was the person doing during the task, or we also might want to know what psychological processes do we think were actually being tapped by the task that they did. So the final part of our ecosystem is the Cognitive Atlas, which is at cognitiveatlas.org. It's a project we started a while ago that's meant to develop sort of what we call an ontology of psychological functions. So the idea is, the only thing that we can do is make people do psychological tasks, right? And then we have to infer what's going on up in their head. So in the project, we sort of strictly distinguish between tasks, which are the things we have them do, and what we call mental concepts or psychological processes, which are the things that we think are up in the head that those tasks are measuring, right? But that's just a theory. So what we try to do in the cognitive analysis is capture in particular these relationships so that for any particular task, we want to know what psychological functions do we think the individual contrasts on that task are measuring. And so the Cognitive Atlas tries to capture that. So for example, if you go to the page on working memory, you can see, there's different kinds of working memory, there's different parts of working memory, and so on. And then you can see all the different tasks that people think measure working memory. You can dig into one of those tasks and see, you can find actually implementations. If there were external data sets, you could link to those. And there's also a bibliography. Currently, we have about 800 mental constructs, about 700 tasks, a couple hundred disorders that we've taken from another ontology. We have a web API that is about to get upgraded. It's currently pretty limited, but we're actually refactoring the entire site, and hopefully in the next few months, we'll have a new site that'll actually make it much easier to get new information in, as well as a much more powerful API. Yeah, question?
How are these mental constructs and tasks, how are these words derived and how are the relationships formed?
Yeah, so the question is, where does the content come from? How are the cognitive concepts and tasks and the relationships between them derived? And I'm actually going to talk a bit about this tomorrow in my talk, but the answer is, in the current Cognitive Atlas, it all comes from quote-unquote experts sitting down and writing what they think. So like it's come heavily from the people in my lab, and so I think it's for the things that my lab knows a lot about, we've done a good job. We started out getting the terms actually by going into the indices of psychological textbooks. Unfortunately, there's no book you can pick up that kind of tells you this, right? So we started out by just trying to figure out, what are all the things that psychologists talk about? But I'll talk tomorrow about how we can start to use natural language processing to try to get at some of these questions as well. Cool. Any other questions? This is great. Okay. So if you go into the Cognitive Atlas, if you go into NeuroVault, you'll see that NeuroVault data sets have a link to Cognitive Atlas terms. That's this link down here. So this is the Cognitive Atlas ID for the particular contrast that's being measured in that data set. And so the idea is ultimately we can link from this data set to that contrast and then back to whatever the things are that we think that particular task is measuring. In this case, it's a risk-taking task. We think it's measuring stuff about risk-taking, but also, people are pressing a button, and so there's response execution, that sort of stuff. So the idea is, ultimately, we want to have an ecosystem that both has a lot of data, but also has a lot of information about the data, a lot of annotation of the data that lets us ask more interesting questions than just sort of what's in the data on their own. So one way to think about this is in terms of ontology-enabled meta-analysis. The idea is, we have data over here. Those data come from tasks. We think those tasks are related to specific cognitive processes. We should be able to actually meta-analyze and relate specific brain systems to specific cognitive functions, sort of integrating out the task, if you will, right? The idea is that tasks are just sort of our kind of experimental figments. What we really want to understand is the relationship between psychological functions and brain systems. So one way that we can do this is by building models we call voxel-wise encoding models, where we, at every voxel, try to model the relationship between activity in that voxel and the presence of particular psychological functions in the data. So this is data that Vanessa Sockett did in my lab a bit ago based on NeuroVault data. So we had 93 tasks from NeuroVault. We went through and annotated each one, which took many, many hours. It's not a trivial undertaking to go in and try to figure out for each of these data sets, what psychological functions do we think that task contrast is actually measuring? And then for we build a statistical model for every voxel. Every row is one of the 93 data sets. And then every column is our encoding of whether that particular data set involved each particular process in the cognitive atlas. We fit a model at each voxel, and then what we can do is now we have the way to actually predict activation maps. So if we do a cross-validation where we leave out a couple of images, and then based on what we think is going on in those images in terms of psychological function, we predict what the activation map should look like. And then we can compare the predicted map to the actual map. And if they're both sort of closer to the right one than the wrong one, then we claim success. And when we do that, we can get 81% correct, but that accuracy relies on us expanding according to the hierarchy of the cognitive atlas. So for example, if we thought that visual object recognition was involved in this task, and we know that visual object recognition is a kind of visual perception, we would also turn on visual perception in the model. And we know that visual perception is a kind of perception, so we also turn on perception in the model. So that gives us this sort of relatively high degree of accuracy. If we don't do that expansion, if we only use the very specific terms that we said were going on in the task, then we still do above chance, because chance is 25% here, but we're only at 56%, so we're much worse at actually doing the task, suggesting that that hierarchical knowledge actually can help us.
Russ, where does the wrong image come from?
The raw image is from NeuroVault.
The wrong image on the right.
Oh, it's just randomly. So it's a leave two out procedure. So
okay.
You have two images and you compare. Each pair. You basically say is this one closer to itself than the other, and is this one closer to itself than the other? Tom Mitchell came up with the idea in his early sort of encoding model stuff. Okay, so in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that we all benefit if we share things as openly as possible. I have never seen anybody's career hurt by openly sharing. I've seen a lot of people's careers helped by openly sharing. So I think that licensing, one, pay attention to licensing, because if you don't, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Two, license things as minimally as possible, minimally restrictive as possible. And I think you can also make an ethical argument that when we as human subjects researchers commit to our subjects, not only that we'll minimize the risk to them, but that we'll maximize the benefit of their participation. If I'm saying I'm just going to hold my data to myself, or I'm only going to let 2 people use it as opposed to letting the world use it, we're necessarily limiting the benefit that their data can have. And we actually have a paper from a couple years ago arguing that it's unethical to share your human subjects data without a really strong reason not to. And I hope I'll also convince you that programmatic access to data and to knowledge, like in the cognitive atlas, is going to enable all kinds of sort of new meta-analytic procedures. So, thank you.
That was great. JB.
So the question is, how do we coordinate between all the different efforts on things like ontologies? Obviously different people could have a different ontology. Different people might want to come up with a different project, do it a different way. How do we coordinate that? And I think, the answer is we have not done a good job yet. I think actually BIDS is the first example where we went from a standard that was like an in-house standard to, with the support of INCF, actually having a meeting, bringing a bunch of people from around the world who were interested in the question, and doing the hard work of getting them to agree on things. And that's the problem, is coordinating is hard. So I think the problem is that we first have to convince people that it's useful to do it, period. I mean, very few people have contributed to the Cognitive Atlas outside of my lab and a few other labs. And that tells me that we've not done a good job of convincing the world that it's a useful thing. I think that if we can convince the world that it's a useful thing, then I think we can make the next step of trying to say, okay, now, and if nobody else has really built a competitor to Cognitive Atlas, right? If that comes along, then we would certainly want to work with them and figure out how to coordinate.
Well, you could in some way argue that BrainMap would be somewhat of a competitor with their taxonomy. I mean, what's the mutual ideas there? Yeah,
there's certainly, you're right. That taxonomy is not living in the same way that Cognitive Atlas is living. I mean, it has been frozen, or at least relatively frozen for a long time, and isn't anywhere near as detailed as Cognitive Atlas. I think it's a relatively high level ontology, and isn't tied back to kind of cognition, and doesn't have the relationship between the annotation about relationships between processes and tasks in the way that we've tried to develop it. I mean, certainly we've put all the terms. Yeah, all the terms are there. Yeah.
This is kind of an odd question, but we're just talking about what succeeds and what doesn't. And it is my impression that the brain imaging data standard is succeeding in generating a lot of interest. Why do you think that has succeeded where other coordinating efforts haven't?
That's a good question. I mean, I think because we've tried to make it clear that, one, that it's useful, in particular because if you've put your data into BIDS, then there's all these tools like the BIDS apps that you can pretty easily apply to the data. So that's why we've been focusing a lot now on building the apps that that you can use once you've done it. So that's been part of the incentive. I think we've also tried to make it as easy to use. It's still not easy, but having the validator, having a way to point your data at a web page and say, does my data fit the standard? And no, I mean, the validator isn't yet great at telling you what you're getting wrong, but it tries to. That I see those as a couple of the main reasons.
JB?
JB? So the question is, how are they going to be sustained? Which specific ones are you're thinking about? OpenNeuro specifically? Yeah. So OpenNeuro is challenging, right? Because we're giving people free computing that's being paid for by a foundation, and we're using Amazon to do the computing, which is not cheap. One of our immediate next steps, once we get the project sort of completely launched, which is happening, I guess, officially tomorrow with Chris's talk, though unofficially now, is that we want to move towards, in fact, we tried to originally do it using academic high-performance computing systems like these national centers. The infrastructure wasn't quite there. There's another project called Open Science Grid that we're really interested in sort of interacting with, and they want to help us. So the goal is to be able to do it using free computing services, or to allow people to do it in-house. So for example, NIH is now basically taking a version of OpenNeuro, and they're going to be running it in-house, and so they can use their own in-house computing if they want to. So the goal is to make it easy to execute the processing in a number of different places, but we had to start somewhere. So we're starting with Amazon because it's highly scalable, and and we have the money right now.
Oh, thanks again. This would now be thank you, but also thank the other speakers, and most importantly, take any remaining comments, questions, thoughts. Everybody happy? Good.
And go to the website and give feedback on the course. I thought that's what you were going to say.
Right, if you're all happy, then you should give positive feedback. Indeed. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.